everything works great in theory, but you don't know when they go and try to build it out. And that's the good experience I'm getting now. I'm seeing some of the pitfalls of trying to build something in Azure and how to work around those, and things don't always work great when you compared to when you talk about them in pre-sales. That's my Microsoft career. I've been in IT industry for 35 years. I won't go back to my COBOL days, but along the way, I've been a developer. Visual Basic is one of the first languages, and then I was a DBA for about a dozen years. I had my own company selling software. I've done all sorts of roles over that time span, mostly, I would say exclusively in the Microsoft domain. And I was a consultant, and I worked for big, small companies, consulting companies. So I have a lot of varied experience, which helps in my current role because I kind of know what it's like to be in the other person's shoes most of the time. And then outside of that, I do a lot of blogging and user groups like this, and I do a lot of SQL Saturdays. I'm doing the PASS Summit next week, and I always enjoy this part of it. I wish I could kind of do this full time. They don't have really an evangelist role that allows you to just go around and blog and present. So the next best thing is some of the pre-sales roles are pretty close to that.
All right. I think everybody got a hint if they didn't already knew, which I think at least half the room here knows already. But you mentioned your two things sparked an idea for me. You mentioned your COBOL days, and also we talked today about data engineering, data analysis, data science. We've been a bit back to the history of the data warehouse and looking at the data in this analytical sense. To kick things off, I wanted to ask you to think about your starting days in the data warehousing, let's say, domain, and if you can describe to us how things looked back then.
Oh, yeah. I do remember the first time I got involved in data warehousing. I was a DBA, so I'm doing a lot of OLTP type of projects, and essentially, as DBA, you put out fires when they come around, and you do tuning, performance tuning. And we had this, I don't know how many years ago, this must have been 15 years ago, I would say. One of my manager said, "Oh, we want to do this data warehouse thing." And I was like, "What's a data warehouse?" And I started reading about it. I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And they had a consultant company come in to build a data warehouse, which was large at the time. I think we were like 2 terabytes. And so we started building something. They started building something on SQL Server, and they asked me to be part of the project. And that's where I got my first taste of what a data warehouse was. And I started reading up on Kimball and Inman. I think I have the Kimball book back there.
Mm-hmm.
and learned the proper techniques, I would say, to build a data warehouse, at least the steps you take, the business requirements, and you write the ETL and you create the database and all that. And I was fascinated by it. And I thought, oh, I definitely want to do this more than, I like this a lot more than a DBA type of role. And I remember going to my manager and said, hey, I'd like to switch over and continue this data warehouse track that I started with this consulting company, and they said, sure, we'll move you over. Well, that led to a lot of contention, and they didn't want me to leave the DBA role, and essentially I almost got fired over it because I got an argument with my manager because I wanted to do some training for data warehousing, and he goes, I don't want to. It was my manager's manager. He said, I'm not going to approve it. And I said, why? He said, you could take this training and then you're going to leave the company. And I said, well, would you rather have people that take training or leave, or people that don't do any training? And he couldn't get it. And we got into a big argument. And eventually I quit the company and joined another company as a data warehouse architect, I would say. Mm-hmm. And from there on, continued building them. And that's when I got into the MPP technology and understanding really large size of data warehouses. And it eventually led me into Microsoft used to have a thing called a parallel data warehouse. So that was an MPP technology, like an Netezza or Teradata. And I still remember the day I was on LinkedIn and somebody posted this thing about PDW, they're looking for consultants. I was like, what the heck is that? And I reached out to them and they told me, and I said, oh, that's fascinating. I think I want to be on a project that's using the parallel data warehouse. And so I was put on that project. They hired me, and through that I met some Microsoft consultants, and one of them I became friends with, and he wound up saying, hey, we think you'd be good for Microsoft. We have, at the time it was called a TSP, but it's a cloud solution architect, and he described the role, and I said, so essentially you just get paid to present? And he goes, yeah, that's pretty much it. So I said, oh, I want to do that. And so I interviewed and got hired as a parallel data warehouse TSP and pre-sales. And that's how I joined Microsoft and moved to New York and started to be exclusively in that area. The parallel data warehouse eventually became the analytics platform system, APS, which became SQL Data Warehouse, which became Synapse. So Microsoft loves changes in their name, but that same code base is now in Synapse.
So you've been with this since its inception, in a sense, at least with Microsoft.
Yeah, the PDW, it was all. I still remember putting some of the hardware in the back of our cars and delivering it to customers back then, and they bought some other company, and it was on Linux, I think it was, or Unix, and they had to switch it to work on Windows, the code base for the data warehousing piece of that, and so yeah, I was there right from the beginning of that. So it's interesting to see how it's morphed into this whole cloud thing, which seems to become pretty popular.
So keeping in that spirit and in that memory, I think you already gave us an example, but maybe you can offer some more. Are there any things that were like big issues, big problems to solve that you haven't fought in years because they got obsolete due to the reach of technology?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think data loading was a big problem back then. I remember the customer had all these SQL servers, and we had to copy the data into the PDW, and so you had to hook it all up, and the drives were pretty slow, so you had to copy the data. I remember that being a big problem. And then to get it to the cloud early on, they didn't have anything like ExpressRoute like they have today, where there's this big pipeline to get to it. So I remember the challenges of trying to copy stuff over the internet, which could take days when they had a lot of data, and then you could be 2 days into it, and then a connection breaks and you lose it. So they found ways to chunk it up and get it into the cloud, even if there was connection problems. That was a big thing. And then I would say the challenge back then too was people not understanding the proper way to distribute the data. In the MPP technology, that you have a distribution key, and so the data is laid out over all these disks. And if you choose the wrong distribution key, you don't really know what you're doing, you can make things a lot worse on there. So queries could take forever if you don't do that right. So that was a big challenge in education. But when it did work right, I still remember the first time we queried, it was a couple hundred terabytes in there. And I wrote a query, and it was a number of joins, and I hit the enter key, and the results came back. I got results back right away, but I thought it was an error because it was too quick. And they go, because then I hit enter and I got up to walk away, and he's going, it's already done. And I said, no, there's no way. But it was billions of rows in a second. And that's when I really saw the power of this MPP technology.
Nice. Very, very nice. Wow. All right. So we had a panel today where we discussed sort of like the general trends in technology and how people tend to get attached to certain things. 10 years ago, the word of the town within our community was NoSQL, and how NoSQL was interpreted as being that we're not going to use SQL anymore. And here we are, years and years later, we're still using it, and there's even more flavors of it, Spark SQL and so on. My question is, do you think the data warehouse is ever going to be obsolete, or are we just going to see new and new flavors of it?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, and definitely SQL is never going to go away, despite a lot of attempts. Microsoft even had this thing called USQL that they have when it was called, I forget what it was called, analytics, something data. And it was a good product, but the USQL is too different than regular SQL. Even now, we have a lot of customers who don't want to go to Spark SQL and they want to use T-SQL. And that's the good thing about, one of the good things about Synapse is you could use T-SQL over data sitting in a data lake. And so people are real reluctant for change, especially when it comes to languages. And when I look at the data warehouse concept, it'll always be there, but the underlying technology could change a lot in the data lakehouse approach. So if you think about a data warehouse, you have this relational storage, and then you have this relational model on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, well, is the relational database always have both those things, or it could be just one of those things? Because the underlying technology is going to change, and the relational engine is starting to be replaced with a data lakehouse, a Delta Lake.
Mm-hmm.
So the storage is different, could be very different, but you still have the concept of relational on top of that I don't think will ever change on that. So Microsoft's got some things in the works that they haven't announced yet to expand on the data lakehouse in there. And the big question with a lot of customers now is, well, I have data in the data lake. Do I copy it to a relational engine, a relational storage, I should say, or do I keep it in the data lakehouse and just have a relational engine on top of that? And so some customers are starting to do that. There's trade-offs with that because you sacrifice speed and things like role of security and other stuff I've blogged about in there. But Microsoft's starting to overcome some of those challenges. So you may see the relational storage be a lot different, but the relational engine will still be the same. And when you talk about like NoSQL, that was a very different engine on top of it. It wasn't a relational engine. And that's caused a lot of challenges with customers. And that's why the relational databases will continue to be so popular. And we're talking about data warehousing, but in OLTP world, everything, except for very large solutions that use NoSQL, everything else is in a relational engine. And so outside of the data warehouse world, I don't see that ever changing for quite a long time. You'll still have a relational engine and a relational storage that are all like SQL Server now. In the data warehouse world, you see it morph into that relational storage change into a data lake storage, but the engine will still be there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. So am I right in saying that we can rest assured that our jobs are safe?
Yeah. Well, I think most of you are probably DBAs. I still remember being a DBA 20-something years ago when people said, oh, it's going to be short-lived. We're not going to need DBAs. I even remember when they said we weren't going to need developers in the 80s in there because technology is going to overcome all that, and you're just going to press a few buttons and anybody can be a DBA. Well, that's definitely not true. It'll never be true in there. You always need a DBA. Yeah, they put things on there to make it easier, automatic indexing and whatnot. But the bottom line is you still need performance tuning. You still need somebody to put out the fires. You still need what falls under a lot of times DBAs is modeling the data and writing stored procedures. And if anything, DBA's jobs have gotten easier and more fun because you're not worried about getting a call 2 o'clock in the morning that the hardware's gone down on that. So all the cloud has done is shifted those responsibilities to Microsoft, and the DBAs can do the fun stuff. And that'll continue. And as easy as they make some of these technologies on there, you're always going to need a DBA. The role may shift a little bit, but it's to the fun side of things. I never liked getting that a 2 a.m. call, so I was always happy to put things in the cloud and not have to do that stuff that I dreaded.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the lake house and what kind of possibilities this brings, and I think also like possibilities in the future. I have to confess it's a bit difficult for me because I have to have these questions in order, and I'm also listening to you, and I kind of get sidetracked. but
Sure.
it's very good. So we are aware of the lake house, and from my personal point of view, I think it's from what we call the modern ways of approaching warehouse the most stable form. But 10 years later now, I think the talk of the town is the data mesh. And I know you've talked about it a lot. You're probably sick of it. I've been to a conference about 1 month ago or 2 months ago in Amsterdam, where somebody asked blatantly a company owner, "Why don't you guys try data mesh? This probably would solve a lot of your ownership issues and yeah, stewardship and stuff like that." And that certain CEO said, "From my point of view, at this point, data mesh is a technical push. I haven't found yet the proper use case where data mesh would entirely fit to solve this issue." So my question is twofold. One is, why do you think people got so attached to the subject? Why is this such a hot topic now? And the second one, because we know that for sure data mesh wouldn't match all companies. What type of company would be proper to adopt a data mesh architecture?
Yeah, those are some great questions, and I have a lot of conversations with customers now about the data mesh. And so, you're a good audience. I'll be honest with you in all my comments on there, and it's not being recorded, so I can really be truthful. Data mesh is a lot of hype, and not that it doesn't have certain use cases where it can be very beneficial, but I will say for 99.9% of the companies, data mesh is not something they should even bother looking at. It's the concept and the idea is great, and that's all data mesh is, a concept. You have to solve a technology, which is not all there yet. And it's not anything new to data mesh. I still remember a lot of these concepts being talked about years ago, but Zamek in her great blog and book put it together really nicely, and it gets people talking about things like data ownership. So it's really good in a lot of aspects, even if you don't implement a data mesh. But the problem with the data mesh is there's a lot of problems I've blogged about, and I honestly didn't even list probably a third of all the problems I've seen about it, because I don't want to be like this data mesh basher. And I'm talking about it next week at the PASS Summit, and Microsoft is building solutions with that are doing the data mesh for customers in there. But there's even if there's say 30 customers out of how many customers in the whole world is a very small percentage, and it's usually very large banks or financial companies that a data mesh kind of fits in. So we find a lot of customers go, "Oh, the data mesh is cool. We want to build something. James, can you talk about it?" And I have to preference with the data mesh. We're talking about what the difference between that is in a data lakehouse and a data fabric and a modern data warehouse, because there's a lot of confusion on there, and a lot of times people don't really get the data mesh, and they want to build it, but they don't have a clear idea of what it is. And then the challenge with data mesh is there's 4 principles of the data mesh, and most solutions that call themselves a data mesh are only using maybe 2 of those principles. So can you really call it a data mesh? If it's 2, sometimes there's even 1 principle on there. So there's a lot of exceptions to the pure data mesh in theory on there. So that's the other thing, is I educate customers, and they essentially say, we're going to build a data lakehouse, but we're going to call it a data mesh because it sounds cool. It's like, okay, that's fine on that. So there's a lot of that going on. But the true pure data mesh, some of the principles about using technology to build out all the domains doesn't exist yet. And Microsoft's got its technology to do some of that, but it's still a long way off. I don't know if it'll ever even get there completely on that. So in the end, with customers, I level set them on all the different architectures, and 9 out of 10 times it comes up with the best solution for you is not the data mesh architecture, or maybe a data fabric or a data lakehouse on that. And in the end, I think the benefit of the data mesh will be that you're starting to talk about those things, like I mentioned, of data ownership and who cleans the data and how does it made available in there. And so that could really help, even if you decide we're not going to use the data mesh. And it's gotten very convoluted because you have a lot of third-party products that are out there saying, hey, we have data mesh in the box, and just use virtualization software over your data lakes and you have a data mesh, which is not a data mesh at all. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I just feel it's my job to educate customers and tell them about all the different approaches of data architectures, and then they can decide what to do, but they almost never decide to go and build a data mesh. And then the biggest challenge that people understand is, if you're going to build a data mesh, it's going to take you 2 to 3 times longer than using another technologies like a data fabric on there. And Zamek even has in her book on one of the pages is, these are all the variables you got to look at to decide if your company's even ready to build a data mesh. And there's, I think, 10 of them, and you have to score high in all these categories. Things like, are you leading edge in there? And if you put that page in the back of her book, nobody would buy the book, because there's really no companies, or very few companies, that are score higher in all those categories. So they're just not right for building a data mesh in there. And then you get people just reluctant to change. And then you got the idea that, well, if I'm going to go and to all these domains in my company and tell them that they have to now create a data lake and a data warehouse in their domain, and they have to make it available to everybody else, they're going to, a lot of times domains are going to go, and I'm not going to do that. I can't barely keep things going right now. If you want the data, take it, but I'm not going to be part of this data mesh. I'm not going to create my own team. And then all you need is one domain to say that, and then you're in trouble on that. And so there's a lot of pushback on that. And this is a topic I can go on forever and say the reasons why not to build a data mesh. And really the bottom line is, yeah, people will do the data mesh, but I think maybe 10 years from now, somebody's going to mention data mesh, and we're going to go, oh, wow, I can't believe that was a thing. Which I've seen happen before on that. It'll probably morph into something else that they'll call it, but maybe a data lakehouse variation of that. But the true pure data mesh is just not something that's going to be used by but a very small percentage of companies.
True. All right. Now, we touched upon data ownership. This is, let's call it a pain point for me during my current project, because I believe at this point, extremely predictable. The data lake of our customer turned into a data swamp. And we're trying to dig into that data and to do some analysis and find the truths in it. And every time we find an anomaly of a certain container, let's say, and we try to follow the line and see how does the data get in the data lake. All right, we have a function. Okay, who did this function? That team. And then we go to that team, and that team sends us to another team. And so if you want to change something, if you find bad data in your data lake, it's very hard to know who to talk to about to fix it, right? Because as a BI consultant, if the source data that I have is of poor quality, then my reports as well are going to be in the end of poor quality. So I think we can agree that maybe data mesh is not the answer for this, but what would be some, let's call them high level principles that people should look out for in the data lake so that you have some governance, some order within it?
Yeah, governance is the one thing I think a lot of customers don't think through enough, and they don't spend enough time up front to make sure that the data is going to be accurate. When I was a consultant, there was a lot of times when I would be building on a data warehouse, and I'd say, well, we need to put a lot of time in the project to clean the data, and the end users would go, our data is completely clean, don't worry about it. And I would always say, I'll bet you $100 right now I'm going to find problems with that data. No, you're not. And sure enough, there'd be problems because, oh, they have a birthday field where they make it required and people don't have the birthday of somebody, so they put it in the future, or somebody's 1,000 years old. Or I still remember some weird situations with, just off the top of my head, one of them it was actually software for a marine biologist to keep track of dolphins and bad data in there. They had dolphins that were 6 inches long. That's like, that doesn't make any sense because the front end system cannot catch all these errors in there. And so the data you get in there, you look at it and you're like, wow, this is really bad data in there. So you have to come up with okay, we're going to have bad data and we're going to clean it, and then how do we define, how do we take account for things that, like there's a 6-inch dolphin or people have birthdays in the future, what are we going to do to clean it? You don't even know that answer. And so you have to have a lot of these discussions with the end users to decide what business rules you're going to apply to this data that comes over that's not clean. Because eventually you'll find that there's holes in their system, and you can plug those data entry errors. But what do you do with all the data that's already come over on there? So you have to go through that, and it's not an easy answer. If things coming across like people's ages and they're way too high or way too low, then we just put them in a null bucket, and so you have to have those conversations in there, and especially when it comes to numbers in there, that can really mess things up, and geographies that are not correct, and then you get into standardizing things, because now you're incorporating the data warehouse source data from many different places, and people could have customer names in there, and the names could be in same customer can be in another system but spelled differently. And this is where a lot of customers don't think through master data management in there. You have to have a system in place that's going to aggregate those numbers, those totals correctly when it's the same person. But how do you know it's the same person? You can't just go by the exact name in there, because people could put junior or middle names in there. And so that's another conversation I have to say, is think of MDM up front, because you're going to need it in there. And it's still going to be a manual process, because it can only do so much to automate merging of the names, but some of that people got to look at manually on there. So you have that goes into making it accurate, because I always say the worst thing that can happen if you're building a data warehouse is that first report is sent to an end user and they go, well, this is not correct. And you lost their trust, and it's really hard to get it back. So you have to work with the end users earlier in the process and start saying, hey, look, I put this report together. I don't know if it's right. Can you check it? And let's work together to come up with, to make sure we get the right number. Because then you also uncover problems that they had in their system of totaling that they never realized was wrong. And I've had situations, I'll give one example of when I was in Houston, and there's oil and gas companies in there, and I was building out the data warehouse, and I couldn't figure out why this one report was totaling up all these sales figures was not correct. And I was looking at the calculation, and people were going, that's the right calculation. And then what we found out was all these individual departments were tweaking that calculation, and they were supposed to use a standard calculation, but they were adjusting it in order for the numbers to look better, so they got a bigger bonus. And those numbers were actually reported to Wall Street, so it was a really big problem. And when I adjusted the report on the standard calculation, there were general managers that were absolutely livid, because even though it was the correct number, it affected their figures and their sales. And so I was seen as this real bad guy. People wanted me fired just for telling the truth on there. So you uncover these issues that nobody anticipates on that. And I've been in rooms where they just argue over what's the proper calculation, or what's the proper way to clean this data. And so you have that battle to run in there. So in the end, building a data warehouse, the technology could be the easy part. The hard part could be to determine the business rules to clean all the data and make it accurate. And I always say, make sure when you're moving this data in the data warehouse, you have auditing going on. So and you talked a little bit about lineage in there. So I always say, well, if you're copying it from a source system into a data lake, into different layers of the data lake, a gold, bronze, silver, and then you have it go into a relational database dedicated pool, and then it may go into a data set in Power BI. Have queries that run on all those steps and total up, say, the numbers for the day, and it should be accurate on there, or else, if not, then something went wrong along the way. So put that controls in place. This way you catch the errors before the end user does in their reporting.
Well, we tried recently to test out, see if we can have at least, let's say, some guidance, because we know there's a lot of bad data in the data lake, but we're in kind of a situation where we don't know what we don't know. So we don't exactly know how many of the sources have bad data, and we tried using Purview to get a first step, let's say, into what seems to be a bit out of the ordinary. But my first conclusion was that even though it has a lot of capabilities and a lot of ways of scanning files out of the box, you still need someone like data steward, for example, to make sense of what those readings mean. So I guess my question would be, how do you see Purview coming into place, and can it help with this issue?
Yeah, that could be a touchy subject. So Purview is a great product, but it's still not all the way there. So I find a lot of customers are using products like Calibra. You didn't hear that from me, but there's a lot of good things coming out in Purview, including things like data quality and better lineage. Mm-hmm. And I would say right now it's a pretty good product, and I think in maybe 6 months it'll be a really good product and maybe catch up to some of the competitors to make it easier, especially if you're in the Microsoft world and you're using Microsoft products, because it integrates really well with those. And the challenge is with lineage is, yeah, Purview can just scan things, but it can't scan like a stored procedure and pull out what's going on inside the stored procedure, or sometimes Databricks it can't. So you have to, in Databricks, pass the information that you've done to change that data into the lineage, and then it can be accurate. But that's an extra step you got to take. So that's part of what you have to come up with, is these general best practices to say, well, if you're doing stuff in Databricks that's transforming it, you need to send that information over to the Purview, and that's kind of a pain to do all that. But I don't see any way around that. None of these products can sort of magically go in and figure out everything you're doing in the stored procedures. That's asking too much of it. So there's got to be that balance of working with the developers and to make sure they put that code in there, and then also having somebody oversee it all. And that's where you have code reviews and do things like that to make sure that's being done. So it's a lot of extra work, but in the end, it's going to benefit, because you can trace back that value in the report all the way back to the source system and all the hoops that it went through to get there. But it's not an easy, and it'll never be a completely automated way to do it, although the products are getting better on that. So the bottom line is, what I talk to a lot of customers about is not just technology, but roles and responsibilities. Yeah. And they want to know, well, how are other companies doing it that you work with, James? Or how does Microsoft do it at the level that they have on that? So we have a lot of conversations with them that are not technical at all, that are just go over the building and maybe a center of excellence. And these are the people that and the roles and the responsibilities that they should have on there. And so that's as big, maybe even more important than the technology, is having the right people and best practices in place.
Right. Yeah. So it kind of goes more to, I guess, on the people side of things than on the technology, for sure. And I think I'm struggling with this at this moment as well. The entire team of our client, they said that our mission is to make the company a more data-driven company. And I think maybe more than 50% about it is about people and understanding data and how to work with it than technologies themselves.
Yeah. And I'm sure people in this room or don't mind change, but a lot of people do not like change, and they don't want. I still go back to when I used to work at the government many years ago, and there were people that just in IT that didn't want to learn new technology, and they didn't like any sort of change, whatever. And so you're always fighting that. When I go to customers, and especially early on in the cloud, it was moved to the cloud, a lot of the people were like, we don't want to move to the cloud. We're going to lose our job, and we don't like things. We like things the way they are. And so there's always that pushback in there. And it's just getting people to understand the benefits and how they can help their career by getting involved in the cloud and overcoming that fear of learning something new. And this can get in the whole other topic of trying to advance your career and trying to embrace change and understanding that learning can be fun and whatnot. And we can make some accomplishments with that in the IT, but then you have the end users and they don't like change. And you're challenging, well, we've always done stuff in Excel. We just want to keep doing things in Excel. And you show them, you have to start showing them something like Power BI, and they go, oh my God, I didn't know that was even possible to do that stuff. Or you show them some machine learning stuff, and you get them excited about that, and then they buy into it, and then they're realizing their job could be made easier, and then they could get business insights and do more with the company, of whether it be saving money or shortening the time to get results and reports out there, and then they start buying into it because their job's going to be made easier. But there's always a lot of pushback in there, and then you have to have a structure in place with the customers. That is it their upper management just pushing down that they have to change, and then you have all that pushback. So I deal with a lot of stuff that I don't think I should, but it's part of human nature sometimes to fight change.
Yep.
And all you can do is, I would always call it guided discovery. When I was in front of a customer and I'm trying to convince them to go in the cloud or use Microsoft products, I wouldn't just tell them, hey, you should use this. I would ask them questions, and they would, and I would say, well, what would make your life easier if you had stuff in the cloud? If you didn't have to worry about disaster recovery and high availability, wouldn't that be great? And they're like, yeah. And okay, how are you doing it now? Oh, we have to back up this stuff into another data center. Oh, but wouldn't it be great if you just had that in the cloud and automatically did that? And you just put it in that tone, and you ask them these questions, and then at the end of it, they go, hey, you know what? I think we should put our stuff on the cloud. And you're like, oh, that's a great idea. You should do that. Because you tell them all these things they should be doing, and then you go and say, oh, and you know what? This product, Synapse, will do all that stuff for you. It already exists. And oh yeah, you know what? Let's use Synapse. Oh, that's a great idea. And it becomes part of learning human nature on that.
Yeah,
and so I think a lot of it is how you talk to people. Just like if you have kids and you tell them something to do, and they want to do the opposite. And I've been a soccer coach for 20 years, and there's a way you teach kids and approach them, and it carries over in coaching, in school teachers, and your kids, and you're training your dogs on that. It's just understanding human nature, and that can make it a lot easier to have successful projects because you talk and approach it the right way with the customer.
Right. Awesome, James. You touched upon cloud, and I really wanted to get your take on this. And please be as biased as you want. We won't care. So in the current landscape, in my mind at least, there are three big players. There's Azure, of course, and there's GCP, and then there's Amazon, right? AWS. In the landscape of data, what do you think that these players do better than the rest? So what does Azure do best than the other tools, and so on?
What makes Microsoft better than Google and Amazon? The people. We go to these shows and these things on Saturdays, Saturday mornings, to help people out. So it's interesting with data architecture, because I could come up with a data architecture, a data fabric, or even a data mesh. And a lot of times when I whiteboarded with customers, I didn't even talk about technology and products. I just said, this is the solution. This is what your data warehouse should look like. This is, you get source systems and ETL, and you land in a data lake, and this is the way the data lake's designed, and then you can copy it into a relational database and then use reporting. And at the very end, I start filling in the pieces, because I can ask a customer, and then of course they're going to be in Azure, but maybe for ETL they don't want to use data factory, they want to use Informatica. And I'm like, oh, okay, doesn't matter. I'll write down Informatica on here. Well, I can do the same thing with AWS or Google. I can just say, instead of the Azure products, I could write down AWS or Google. So in the end, there's not a lot of difference between technology-wise. You could argue that, well, AWS is maybe a little better in certain IaaS things, and Microsoft certain PaaS things. And then, well, Microsoft's got the benefit of having all levels of the stack on there. So we have everything from Azure to the operating systems, and maybe that helps us. And you can say Google maybe has a little better advantage in machine learning type of things, but their customer base is very different. They're usually a lot smaller companies. And I don't know if I've ever had to compete against Google. I've had plenty against Amazon, but never against Google. on there, because they just cater to different types of businesses on there. But in the end, Google or Amazon, I think, and Azure, they're going to do the job no matter what. And I don't, and I blogged about this too, about multi-cloud, and I don't see that happening very much, even though people talk about it, is that there's a lot of problems with trying to be in two different clouds in there. And most times customers talk about it because they're playing to try to get a better cost out of each cloud in there. Hey, if you don't read my pricing, I may go to Amazon and stuff. But I don't really see the main reason people said was, well, maybe I want to use Google because they're some of the machine learning stuff's better, and I'll use them for machine learning and Azure for everything else. But that's just a lot of problems with that. Is the skill sets that you have to now get, and managing the security in two different clouds and trying to interact together. It's just a real pain in there. So in the end, it's interesting too, because you're starting to see things within Microsoft where, well, I gotta be careful, some of them have been announced yet, but there's better integration with Amazon and S3 and things like that. And we could much more easily just say, well, if you have stuff in Amazon, we don't care. You can keep storing stuff in there. We're just going to we have pieces in place that'll very easily link to it and pull it in if you want to keep doing that. And so, honestly, the biggest competition Microsoft has is with Snowflake on that. So that's a big hot topic that we have. And Microsoft's pretty interesting. The way they've always run the company is sometimes they buy products and incorporate them. Sometimes they compete. Sometimes they directly from the beginning. Sometimes they have a partnership with a customer, and then with a company, and then behind the scenes they're working to better that product, and then it starts out as a partnership, and then eventually becomes competitors on that. It's just the way they do business. And I've asked sometimes the higher ups, why do they do that? And they said, well, although we have a big R&D, we can't go and spend a lot of time and effort in something that we don't know if it's going to hit it big. So we let other people do it. And if it all of a sudden it's going to hits big, then maybe we'll go buy those companies, or we'll partner with them, or we'll try to compete against them. And it's worked over the years. And so you have some interesting dynamics. We used to be good partners with Snowflake, and then that deteriorated. And then we're good partners with Databricks, although we're competing with them with Synapse Spark. And that's a whole other conversation that you have with customers in that, and that could take a long time to discuss. But in the end, all the clouds can solve the problems that customers are having. And it's just a matter, a lot of times, is the cost differences, and then the people. And Microsoft stands out a lot because we're helping customers not just with Azure Cloud, but Office 365 and on-prem licenses and SQL Server, and all that goes a long way into getting people in Azure. And then the way we're set up too, they get a lot of free help with CSAs and whatnot, and MTCs, and a lot of times it comes down to the people. And I like to think Microsoft's got really good people who are very helpful. Not that the other clouds don't, but sometimes it's the attention you give to customers that separates you out from other cloud providers.
Fair enough. I think that's a very good answer. Keeping it in the cloud world, one of the I think interesting ideas that I heard lately was that theoretically, at least speaking, there is nothing stopping smaller companies pulling resources together and kind of create their own mini clouds. My question is, what big change do you think is going to happen in the cloud landscape in the next following years?
Well, Microsoft's talking about underwater data centers and data centers in space. And
wow.
Yeah, they actually have a thing about space now. And and they've been testing underwater data centers for a couple of years now. It's a pretty good success of that. So I don't. I mean, the future of cloud is everything's going to be in the cloud one day. It's kind of crazy if you're building your own cloud or have hesitancy being in the cloud. A lot of changed with people used to be allowed, the cloud's not secure, and I'm going, it's way more secure than anything you've done on-prem. And there's still a few use cases, very rare, but of customers who don't use the cloud or have their own cloud. It's if you have internet, don't have internet, if you're in a cave somewhere or out in the ocean or in space and there's no way to connect, you have to do stuff outside of the cloud. And or if it's millisecond response time, if you have a machine sitting in, say, a post office and it's directing where mail is going to go, it doesn't have time to go to the cloud. But those are very few situations that I see. And a lot of times with customers have this misconception of the cloud that it's not secure or it's not reliable. And what we'd always do is take them to a data center tour, and that would blow their minds away, because we would go into these rooms where I'd ask them, like, how many generators do you have for backup? Oh, we got 2 big generators. And I bring them into a room that's got 50 generators that are 8 feet tall. And I said, this is just one room, and we have a couple more down the hall of other generator rooms. And the battery rooms, which you couldn't get close to because you get electrocuted, they have thousands of batteries sitting in there as a backup in there. And then they'd see these rows and rows of pods now where these data centers now that they're like the 5th generation, they would just order I think it's 700 servers they would have in this pod, which is, they would hook it up to the back of a tractor trailer and just bring it to the data center and drop it off. And they'd plug in some electricity and water, and it's set to go. Yeah. And when things would break in there, they would just ignore it because everything's replicated 3 times in there. So if something goes down, it automatically creates another copy in there, and then there's no downtime in there. So a technician from, say, Dell would come once every month and go and fix or pull out all the bad hardware. And it's just a very different situation now than it used to be. And it's so much easier in there. So anybody who's going to do their own cloud is just, I would say they're pretty crazy. They maybe had too many beers in there, to be honest with you. It's just educating them. And there's some people that think they can do it better, especially in New York. There was certain finance companies who thought, oh, I still remember one customer said, when I talked about the parallel data warehouse, they're like, oh, we can build that on our own quicker. And I thought, do you know what went behind the scenes to build out this technology and make all this hardware work together? And you think you can just go and create it on your own? I was like, okay, good luck with that. So to me, it's, especially new companies starting out, why would you go and get any hardware? And you could just go in the cloud in a couple minutes, you have all your VMs or any PaaS services you want. So I think it's just educating people, and the more educated they are, the more they're going to leave all their solution in hardware and is to one of the cloud providers.
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. James, I literally haven't felt the time passed. It's almost 1 hour since we've been talking. I have a bunch of questions I still have on my paper that I didn't get to, but I think I'm gonna ask you one more question, and we're gonna end it here. So also keep in mind of your time. So here it goes. You've been mapping this domain for a long time, and you've been documenting, I think, at least part of it. We in our team, we read your blog almost like the Holy Bible to get in touch with the new things that happen. My question is, in all of this time, was there ever a point where technology took you by surprise? And if so, what was it and why?
This whole internet thing sure took me by surprise. I remember they CompuServe and AOL and getting those damn AOL discs in the mail, it seemed like every week. And Prodigy was a big one. And never thought you'd have this situation. I mean, this is more the hardware side of it. But I've been around so long, I still remember the phone lines and having to call And the day I got a direct connection to the internet, I was always on the internet and the World Wide Web. And I remember writing websites that were in HTML, and you just had a notepad and you just started coding, and how much things have changed. It's hard to nail it down one because everything has progressed so much. It's crazy. Even my son, who's a programmer now, he shows me some of the stuff that he's doing to code, and I go, oh my God, I remember how difficult it was to code for the web, and now everything is drag and drop and automated. And he, as he says, others say, now a good programmer is just being somebody who can Google really well and pull out the code in there. But I still continually get surprised and with some of the new technology that is like, this is so damn cool. I know I said that with Synapse. I can't say much, but I'll say a future iteration of Synapse that I'm having access to is really cool. And so I'm always surprised how surprised I am with new technology that comes out. I remember Power Apps a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
When it came out, I thought, oh my goodness, this is friggin' awesome. It made it so easy to build a solution. And it reminded me of when many years ago when Visual Basic first came out. And before that, you were doing things, it was all on a command line. You were typing code in there. And this Visual Basic thing came out where you just drag and drop these little pieces and you build out. Yeah. I was fascinated by that. And I got the same feeling when I saw Power Apps a couple of years ago and how far that's come along and made it so much easier to build solutions. And then you have the whole Power Platform in there is incredible. How that whole product of the Power Automate and how they made it easier to hook things up on there, which is great because a lot of that becomes part of a data warehouse solution now. And it's talking to customers about, well, there's another way you can do things. If you want to move it around, instead of using ETL, you have the Power Automate, or you can do things with Power Apps and integrate it with the data warehouse now. And so the integration piece of that is really cool. And it's hard to pin down one thing because at Microsoft, I'm continually amazed with some of the products they come out with. And I would say I'm amazed that I still get amazed that you think, oh, I've seen it all, but then this new cool thing comes out and you're like, wow, that's really awesome in there. And even Power BI, what that has morphed into. I still remember that when it first came out, I thought, oh, it's a pretty cool report writer. And now report writing is just a small piece of it. It does all this other stuff. And you can essentially build your own complete data warehouse in it. It does the ETL and the data lake, and it's just amazing on there. So I'm always surprised with technology, and I just think, can you imagine what's going to be like 10 years from now? And I already talked to my son about, hey, I remember. Let me tell you about the days of COBOL, and he's probably 10 years, 20 years from now going to talk to his son and say how old school stuff was that he's doing today.
Wow, that's great, James. Well, I think that's about it. Guys, come on, let's give a big round of applause for James. I think I undoubtedly can say that this has been great fun for me. I'm still processing it. I think for the people here as well. Once again, James, thanks you a lot for taking your time to talk with us, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, I love having these conversations. This is a lot of fun for me, and I always learn a couple of things too, just based on the questions I'm asked. And if anybody out there has any follow-up questions, just shoot me an email. It's jamesserra3@gmail.com or jamesserra@microsoft.com, and I'm happy to answer that. I'm always surprised how little people reach out to me. I don't know. Sometimes they think I'm not going to answer. I'm too busy, but I'm not. So I'm happy to help out with anything. So just shoot me an email.
All right, that sounds lovely. All right, guys.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm gonna go. It's only 11 a.m. here, but I'm gonna go get a beer soon.
All right, bye. Thank you a lot.
All right, thanks everyone. Appreciate it. Bye.